Today, we are revisiting the Radeon RX 9070 XT to compare performance using the latest display drivers with the data that we originally collected for our day one review, and we'll be retesting 16 games using the same settings from the review. Now, I'm doing this because we've noticed that the 9070 XT appears to have improved since we first reviewed it, and others have reported seeing the same thing online. However, to make sure these improvements have indeed come the way of improved Radeon drivers, I'll also be including the GeForce RTX 5070 Ti, because if it's also become faster, then it's more likely that the gains people are reporting and seeing due to the game updates, game patches, rather than Radeon driver updates. Or, perhaps it could be a bit of both. So I'm keen to see what we find. But before we do, today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Be Quiet and their brand new range of light-based 600 and 900 series cases. The light-based 600 is available with 4 Lightwings LX 120mm PWM fans, 3 of which are reversed so they look the same throughout the case, while the more affordable DX model forgoes the pre-installed fans for those of you that like to bring your own. Both models feature a huge LED light bar that spans the front and top, featuring over 1.2 meters of ARGB LEDs, and you'll also find glass panels at the front and side for a stunning panoramic view of all your PC components. What we love most about the light base though is the ability to orient the case multiple different ways using relocatable feet. You can invert the case in literally seconds. There's also room for 2 360mm radiators, full-size GPUs with vertical mounting options, and loads more. So for a full rundown of what the light-based 600 and 900 series has to offer, please check the links in the video description. Okay, so the test here is pretty basic. As I said, we're taking the 9070 XT and 5070 Ti and comparing the previously gathered review data to updated data using the latest drivers. The day one reviews featured 18 games, but I've only been able to update the data for 16 of them. Marvel Rivals has been dropped as the replay previously used for testing is no longer valid, and I had to drop War Thunder as I'm having a few stability issues with the game, which appears to affect both Radeon and GeForce GPUs, so I'll have to investigate what's going on there when I have a bit more time. Other than that though, everything else remains the same, so once again I will be using my 9800X 3D test system with 32GB of DDR5 6000 CL30 memory, running the latest version of Windows 11. Okay, let's get into the data. First up, we have Star Wars Jedi Survivor, and this game hasn't received an update this year, so any performance changes would likely be due to driver improvements. That said though, neither the 9070 XT nor the 5070 Ti have seen any change in performance since the review data, as the latest, most up-to-date drivers provided the exact same performance at 1440p and 4K. So let's move on. It has been years since A.T.A.L.K.E.R Requiem was patched, so again, any changes in performance here can be directly attributed to driver changes. And in this example, we're seeing exactly that. Previously, the 5070 Ti was 8% faster than the 9070 XT, but with the latest drivers, they're now neck and neck, both averaging 122 FPS at 1440p. And the same is also true for the 4K testing. Previously, the GeForce GPU was 5% faster. Today, though, they're both delivering the same 68 FPS in our test. Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty hasn't been updated since January of this year, so well before the release of the 9070 XT. So the gains we're seeing here can be attributed to drivers. Now, whereas the review data saw the 9070 XT and 5070 Ti delivering virtually identical results, with the updated drivers, the Radeon GPU is now 4% faster. A very small advantage, and overall performance is still very much the same. And it's also worth noting that the 5070 Ti also saw a small increase of 4% here, so there have been some GeForce improvements as well. In fact, the GeForce gains are more notable at 4K, where the 5070 Ti matches the 9070 XT, as we saw a nice 9% increase for the 1% lows. Dying Light 2 has seen a few game updates, and despite that, the performance figures from our review data remain accurate with less than a 2% deviation using the latest drivers, and this was true for both the 1440p and 4K testing. Dragon Age the Veilguard hasn't seen any game updates since the release of the 9070 XT, and AMD has also been unable to improve performance. We did see a 3% increase for the 5070 Ti at 1440p, though it's hard to say what's responsible for this change when comparing the 4-month-old review data with this updated data. Performance at 4K though, that does remain the same, with less than a 2% deviation. Marvel's Spider-Man Remastered hasn't seen any updates this year, so the performance gains we're looking at here for the 9070 XT can solely be attributed to driver improvements. And firstly, I realized the gains here are pretty shocking, so I made sure to triple check the data. And worse still, the 5070 Ti has somehow become 7% slower, and again, this data was triple checked. But really, it's the 27% increase in performance for the 9070 XT that is the most shocking result here, jumping up from 169 FPS to 214 FPS. This is a massive turnaround for the Radeon GPU. Previously, the review data showed the 9070 XT to be 8% slower. Today, though, it's now 24% faster. That's roughly the kind of gains we see from Radeon GPUs in a title such as Call of Duty. Things do change a bit though at 4K. Here the GeForce GPU saw no performance change, while the 9070 XT saw a much more mild 7% uplift. Still, that meant whereas previously both GPUs delivered similar performance, the 9070 XT is now 7% faster. Next up, we have Hogwarts Legacy, and this game has received a few updates this year, though I don't believe any performance-related patches have been released since the arrival of the 9070 XT. What I can tell you for sure though, is since first collecting our review data, the 5070 Ti has seen no change in performance, while the 9070 XT has seen a massive 18% uplift, jumping from 130 FPS to 153 FPS. And that's a big deal, given the Radeon GPU was already slightly faster in this title, so we're now looking at a 21% performance advantage. Oddly, however, the massive performance gain seen at 1440p doesn't apply to 4K. Here we're only looking at a 5% gain, though that still meant the 9070 XT was 10% faster than the 5070 Ti, so a respectable performance advantage. And it's also well worth noting that the 1% lows were almost 30% stronger for the Radeon GPU. The Last of Us Part 1 saw no performance change for the 9070 XT at 1440p, though oddly the 5070 Ti became 4% slower, so not a big drop off, but now it's roughly on par with the 9070 XT. Then at 4K we see no real change for either GPU. Star Wars Outlaws saw a very minor improvement for the 9070 XT, 3% at 1440p, which was enough to match the 5070 Ti. The 4K data though, on the other hand, that went unchanged, so performance overall was very similar, with the 5070 Ti having a very slight edge. Starfield saw a very slight performance increase for the 9070 XT at 1440p, a 5% boost taking the average frame rate from 79 FPS to 83 FPS. The 5070 Ti on the other hand dropped 2 FPS, resulting in the same 83 FPS on average. Then at 4K, the results go largely unchanged, so here the 9070 XT and 5070 Ti are neck and neck with 55 FPS. Delta Force is another title where performance of the 5070 Ti slipped ever so slightly, this time dropping by 3% down to 168 FPS. The 9070 XT on the other hand saw a big 14% jump in performance, going from 160 FPS to 183 FPS, and that meant whereas previously it was 8% slower than the 5070 Ti, it's now 10% faster, so a huge turnaround there. Then at 4K, the 5070 Ti was previously 7% faster, but now with the improvements to the 9070 XT, both GPUs delivered the same level of performance. God of War Ragnarök shows a pretty similar situation, though in this example, the 5070 Ti improved by 2.5%, but that is nothing when compared to the 9070 XT, which enjoyed a 10% boost, making it 9% faster than the 5070 Ti. Yet despite the gains at 1440p, we saw no such improvement at 4K. In fact, the data goes completely unchanged. Next up we have Counter-Strike 2, and here the 5070 Ti produced very similar results with the latest drivers when compared to what we saw in the 9070 XT review. The Radeon GPU though, that became considerably faster, boosting performance by 23%, now beating the 5070 Ti. Whereas previously, the Radeon GPU was 10% slower, it's now 10% faster. Even at 4K, the 9070 XT saw a 14% uplift, though that wasn't enough to match the 5070 Ti in this example, at least for the average frame rate where the GeForce GPU was 4% faster. Not a big margin by any means, but compared to what we saw at 1440p, the results are quite different. All of that said, the 9070 XT did produce stronger 1% lows. S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2 has been updated since collecting our review data, though we haven't seen any change to the GeForce performance. That, however, is not the case for the 9070 XT, which saw a rather substantial 12% boost, jumping from 58 FPS to 65 FPS, and that allowed it to match or rather slightly nudge ahead of the 5070 Ti, especially when looking at those 1% lows. So overall, I'd say both are delivering a pretty similar experience now. And it's a similar story at 4K. An 8% increase for the 9070 XT allows it to match the 5070 Ti, but with slightly better 1% low performance. Space Marine 2 was updated in April, and the patch notes mention slightly improved performance. Though that's not what we're seeing here with the 5070 Ti, but I knew the performance we were looking at previously was due to some kind of driver issue, and I was able to confirm this with Nvidia. The good news is, since then, Nvidia has addressed the issue, and now the 5070 Ti is 36% faster at 1440p. The Radeon GPU has also seen a 10% performance boost, so overall when using the latest drivers, performance between these two GPUs is quite similar, though the tables have turned, and now it's the GeForce GPU that is 6% faster rather than 14% slower. And that Nvidia driver issue or bug, whatever it was we were seeing previously, was even worse when increasing the resolution to 4K. The review data showed just 44 FPS for the 5070 Ti, compared to 60 FPS for the 9070 XT, making the Radeon GPU 36% faster. However, using the latest drivers, the 5070 Ti is now 63% faster with 72 FPS on average, while the 9070 XT saw a 10% boost, rendering 66 FPS on average. So once again, the tables have turned on this one, handing Nvidia a 9% win. Finally, we have Call of Duty Black Ops 6, and here both GPUs have seen some improvement since collecting the review data. The 5070 Ti saw a more mild 6% gain, while the 9070 XT became 14% faster, so a significant increase there. This means whereas the 9070 XT was 22% faster in our review, it's now 30% faster, so a massive performance advantage in this title. And it's a similar story at 4K. Just a 3% increase for the 5070 Ti, and a much more substantial 13% increase for the 9070 XT, making the Radeon GPU 30% faster with the latest drivers. Okay, so across the 16 games tested, the 9070 XT saw on average a 9% improvement with the latest game and driver updates. In comparison, the 5070 Ti saw just a 2.5% improvement. And this means, whereas the 5070 Ti was 2.5% faster than the 9070 XT based on our review data, using the latest drivers and this 16-game sample, the 9070 XT is now 3% faster. So a swing in the results, but overall both products remain highly competitive, delivering very similar performance overall. The 4K results, on the other hand, they don't really change all that much, just a 4% improvement for the 9070 XT and 3% for the 5070 Ti, resulting in both GPUs delivering the exact same performance overall at 4K. And of course there was nothing in it previously anyway, so no real changes here. Now here's a look at where the 9070 XT did and didn't see performance gains. The big performance improvements were seen in Spider-Man, Counter-Strike 2, Hogwarts Legacy, Delta Force, Call of Duty, S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2, Space Marine 2, and God of War Ragnarök, all showing gains of 10% or greater. We see just 6 of the 16 games tested saw gains of 5% or less, and those games included Starfield, Star Wars Outlaws, The Last of Us Part 1, Jedi Survivor, Dying Light 2, and Dragon Age the Veilguard. However, at 4K, there were far fewer big gains to be seen. Just 3 of the games tested produced double-digit improvements, with 10 of the 16 games at 5% or less. In fact, there were 7 games that saw no performance change at all. So it does seem as though at lower resolutions, the earlier RDNA 4 drivers weren't as efficient as they could have been. And this makes sense, as previously the 5070 Ti and 9070 XT were very competitive at 4K, but the 9070 XT often fell behind, sometimes well behind, at 1440p. And that really wasn't something that I expected to see. If anything, I expected the opposite to be true, given that the GeForce GPU utilizes GDDR7 memory, and therefore has 40% more memory bandwidth, which you'd expect to come in handy at those higher resolutions. As impressive as these gains are, overall it doesn't really change much. Previously, the 5070 Ti and 9070 XT were evenly matched, and that still remains true today. Overall, they should deliver a very similar gaming experience. So then, as has always been the case, it's the price that will largely be the deciding factor. Over in the US, at Newegg, the 9070 XT can be had for $700 US, so not the $600 US MSRP, but we are getting there slowly. The 5070 Ti, on the other hand, that appears to be back up to $900 US, which is an almost 30% premium, and I have no idea why anyone would pay that. Then, over here in Australia at PC Case Gear, it's a pretty similar situation to what we see in the US. The 9070 XTs are currently in stock for $1,200 AUD, whereas the 5070 Ti's cost at least $1,600 AUD, making the GeForce option 33% more expensive. The only caveat here being that there are 4 5070 Ti's in stock and available at that price, whereas there is just a single 9070 XT, and it's the Power Color Hellhound, with the next cheapest in-stock model being Sapphire's Pulse at $1,300, but we are looking at just one retailer here. Anyway, as nice as it is to see the 9070 XT improving as the drivers mature, feeding into that FineWine narrative, though Radeon A3 kind of killed the FineWine angle with the lack of FSR support, but that's a different story. We won't get into that here. As usual, though, I will continue to track the progress of these GPUs with future benchmark content, so make sure you subscribe for that. But as far as this video goes, we're done for now. If you enjoyed the testing, please do give the video a like. As I said, you can subscribe for more content. And we also have the YouTube join button or Patreon if you want to get more hardware unbox goodness. We have an exclusive Discord server. We do monthly live streams for members only. Behind the scenes content, I've been doing a bit of that lately. And Q&A stuff. So yeah, check that out if you're interested, but if not, that is perfectly fine, and I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.